At 2:52 on the afternoon of September 15th, 1942, a column of black smoke stood up over the South Pacific, and every man on the deck of the destroyer USS O'Brien turned to look at it. 5 miles away, an American aircraft carrier was burning. The general alarm sounded. The captain rang up 25 knots and threw the rudder hard right. And 2 minutes later, a lookout saw the thing every destroyer sailor dreads. A torpedo wake, 1,000 yards out, running straight in. The ship was already accelerating, already swinging. The torpedo slid past her stern and missed by 4 feet, maybe 5. Men stood at the rail and watched it go. And that was exactly what the second torpedo needed. While every eye on deck followed the first wake, another one was already inside 200 yards, aimed at the front of the ship. The official damage report compressed what happened next into one dry line. O'Brien was bracketed by the 2 torpedoes, and time did not permit further evasive action. The warhead struck beside the stem and blew off the first 10 frames of the hull. The whole ship whipped like a fishing rod. And then, nothing. No fire. Not one man dead. The damage looked almost light, and by evening O'Brien was steaming away under her own power. What nobody aboard understood was that the torpedo had already killed her. It would just take 34 days and 2,800 miles of ocean for the ship to find out. And it had never been aimed at her at all. It was the far end of a single salvo. 6 torpedoes fired at a carrier in a different task force, miles away. In the space of 9 minutes, that one salvo hit 3 American warships. A carrier, a battleship, and this destroyer. The United States Navy could not explain it. Within weeks, the commander of the Pacific Fleet put the confusion on paper. It is not clear how many submarines attacked. There may have been 2 or possibly 3. The escorting destroyers never located a single one. For years afterward, the Navy split the credit between 2 different Japanese submarines. Both guesses were wrong, and the man on the other end of the periscope, the one who fired all 6, would die without ever learning the full result of what is arguably the most effective torpedo attack any submarine ever made. The salvo of September 15th is usually told as luck. The record reads differently. It reads like a man refusing to accept 2 failures. Lieutenant Commander Takakazu Kinashi took command of the submarine Un-19 in the middle of July 1942, 3 weeks before the Americans landed on Guadalcanal. He was a veteran submariner who had already commanded another boat, and I-19 was one of the big ocean cruisers Japan sent to lie in wait along the American supply line, with an aircraft hangar built into her deck and a catapult for a folding floatplane. In August, his orders sent him into the waters southeast of the Solomons, where the American carriers were known to patrol, with instructions to save his torpedoes for supply convoys and capital ships. On August 25th, he got his first chance. He brought I-19 to the surface late in the afternoon and found himself looking at an American cruiser with a destroyer for escort. He dived and began an approach, and the geometry beat him. The range was too great. The targets ran on and left him behind. The next afternoon, his sound operator picked up something better. Many ships, and among the propeller sounds, the heavy beat of an aircraft carrier. The force that passed over the horizon that day included USS Wasp. Kinashi worked his boat toward the sound for hours. The approach failed again. Understand what an approach meant for a submarine of 1942, because everything that happened on September 15th sits on it. A submerged boat crawled at a walking pace. A carrier task force zigzagged at 16 knots. The submarine commander could not chase. He could only predict, position, and wait for the enemy to make a mistake and walk into the circle his torpedoes could reach. Twice in 2 days, the Americans had not made the mistake. For the next 3 weeks, Kinashi held his patrol area and waited. At 9:50 on the morning of September 15th, the sound operator reported heavy screws again. Kinashi came to periscope depth, swept the horizon, and saw empty ocean. The ships were out there beyond the curve of the Earth, and for a full hour he tracked them by sound alone. At 10:50, the mast came over the horizon. In the lens, An aircraft carrier, a heavy cruiser, destroyers. 9 miles away. He started his third approach. For nearly an hour, it looked like the third failure. The Americans zigzagged, then changed course entirely. And then the carrier did something Kinashi could not have arranged with a prayer. She swung into a long, slow turn to conduct flight operations, and the turn pointed her at his periscope. The carrier was Wasp, and she was doing her job. She was the ready-duty carrier that day, covering a convoy carrying 4,000 Marines of the 7th Regiment to Guadalcanal. Planes had to be launched, recovered, refueled, rearmed, and the ship had to steer by the weather to do it. Routine put her in the circle. At 2:45 in the afternoon, from under 1,000 yards at a track angle off the carrier's starboard side, Kinashi fired all 6 torpedoes in his forward tubes. They were Type 95s, the 21-inch submarine version of Japan's Long Lance, running on pure oxygen, faster than anything in the American inventory and carrying a heavier warhead than anything American submarines fired. And in 1942, unlike the American Mark 14, they were not plagued by duds. 6 of them left the tubes seconds apart and spread out into the afternoon. What those 6 torpedoes did over the next 9 minutes is on record in 3 separate American damage reports. What the men who fired them and the men who received them understood about it at the time and for years afterward is the actual story. On Wasp's deck, the afternoon was routine right up to the last few seconds. She had just recovered 11 aircraft. Crews were refueling and rearming planes. The gasoline system was open and pumping. Fighters sat fueled and armed on the hangar deck. At 2:44, a lookout screamed the sighting. 3 torpedoes, 3 points forward of the starboard beam. The torpedoes had been fired from so nearby that they were still rising to their set depth when the lookout saw them. The captain threw the rudder hard over. It was far too late for 14,000 tons of carrier. 2 torpedoes struck seconds apart, both on the starboard side forward. The first hit at frame 36, in way of the ship's gasoline storage. The second hit at frame 62, beside the bomb magazines. About 20 seconds later, a third explosion shook the ship, and we will come back to that third explosion because the argument over what it was outlived the war. 1 torpedo ran on past the carrier and did not stop. It passed directly under the destroyer Lansdowne in Wasp's screen without detonating, and Lansdowne's radio operator got off the warning that crossed 5 miles of ocean faster than the torpedoes did. Torpedo passed directly under us, coming directly for force, course 080, because there was a second American force out there. The 2 carriers were covering the same convoy in separate formations, about 5 miles apart, close enough to see each other's smoke and far enough that each kept its own ring of escorts. Wasp with one task force and Hornet with the other, screened by the new battleship North Carolina. The rest of Kinashi's salvo, fired at one carrier, was now running across open water into the other fleet. On North Carolina, the report from the destroyer Mustin came in seconds later. 6 words. Torpedo past astern, headed for you. The battleship's officer of the deck ordered right full rudder and emergency flank speed. The ship was still swinging when at 2:52, the torpedo arrived. Nobody aboard saw it until just before it hit. It struck the port side forward, abreast the number 1 main battery turret, 20 feet below the waterline, below the armor belt, in the thinnest section of the ship's underwater protection. A column of oil and water climbed as high as the stacks. A man on deck was washed overboard. Yellow-brown smoke rolled through every open compartment in the forward third of the ship, and at 2:54, 2 minutes later, the last pair of torpedoes reached the destroyer O'Brien on the far side of Hornet's screen. One missed astern by 4 or 5 feet while the crew watched it. The one nobody watched hit beside the stem. 9 minutes, 1 salvo. A carrier burning, a battleship holed, a destroyer bracketed and struck. And beneath the wakes, 6 minutes after his last torpedo hit, Kinashi's crew heard the first depth charge detonate above them. Wasp died of gasoline. That needs saying precisely because the torpedoes did not sink her. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, after studying everything, wrote it flatly. Watertight subdivision, stability, and reserve buoyancy were all adequate to absorb the damage. Her engines ran until the order to abandon ship. If the ship had carried nothing flammable, she would have survived the hits and steamed home. But the first torpedo had opened her gasoline stowage, and her system was in use. Mains charged, hoses out, planes fueling. Flame appeared on the water alongside within seconds of the impact. Below decks, gasoline ran through ruptured compartments. In the hangar, the shock of the detonations snapped the lashings of aircraft triced up under the overhead, and they fell onto the fueled and armed planes parked beneath them, snapping landing gear, splitting tanks. Fire stood up in 3 separate parts of the ship at once. Then the mathematics of firefighting collapsed. The torpedoes had broken the forward loop of the fire main. Pressure everywhere forward went to nearly nothing. Hose teams on the hangar deck stood with limp hoses, watching a gasoline fire build. The ship had one of the best firefighting systems afloat. Pumps for 2,000 gallons a minute, water curtains, sprinklers. Most of it was never brought to bear. The broken section was never isolated from the rest. At 2:49, 4 minutes in, gasoline vapor exploded somewhere on the second deck. At 3:05 a second, heavier blast wrapped the forward half of the island in a ball of flame and threw a quadruple anti-aircraft mount off its base. The bridge was abandoned. At 3:10, a third explosion lifted the No. 2 aircraft elevator out of its pit and dropped it askew across the opening, hurling steel plating 150 feet in the air. Ready ammunition cooked off continuously. On the bridge, the body of a gun captain, thrown from a destroyed mount, landed beside the captain. The captain was Forrest P. Sherman, in command for 3.5 months. He did what the book said. He used rudder and engines to hold the flames on the forward part of the ship and keep them off the rest. He slowed, backed, tried to pull his ship out of the burning pool of her own fuel spreading across the water. The pool followed her, fed from the ruptured tanks. At 3:15, 30 minutes after the hits, the fires owned the forward half of the ship. Sherman conferred with his executive officer, then with the admiral aboard, and gave the order no captain rehearses out loud. Abandon ship. It was 3:20 in the afternoon. The attack was 35 minutes old. The abandonment took 40 minutes, and it was, by every account, orderly. Wounded men were lowered into rafts first. Whole divisions waited their turn at the rails aft, because the forward half of the flight deck was untouchable. The delays, Sherman noted, came mostly from men refusing to leave before the wounded were away. The landing signal officer, a lieutenant named David McCampbell, went off his own platform into the sea. Remember the name because the Navy would hear it again. At 4 o'clock, satisfied that no living man remained aft, on deck, or in the hangar, Sherman swung over the lifeline on the fantail and slid down into the water, the last man off his ship. 5 destroyers picked more than 2,000 men out of the sea, while torpedo wakes crossed the rescue area. The Japanese boats were still hunting. 1 man was not in the count and not in the water. Jack Singer, a war correspondent for the International News Service who had ridden the ship into the campaign to write about her, was last seen in the wardroom lounge. 25 officers and 150 men died with him. The burning hull would not sink. She drifted with her dead through the afternoon, torn by 4 more heavy explosions as evening came on. At nightfall, the destroyer Lansdowne, her decks crowded with the survivors she had just pulled from the water, was ordered to put the carrier down. Now count what that took. Kinashi had needed 6 torpedoes for 3 ships. Lansdowne, firing at a stationary, burning abandoned hulk at point-blank range, fired 5 American torpedoes to get 3 hits. And even then, Wasp took nearly an hour more to go. At 9 o'clock that night, she went down by the head in a burning pool of gasoline and oil that lit the ocean for miles. There was an audience. Through a periscope, off in the dark, another Japanese submarine, I-15, watched the American destroyer torpedo the American carrier and noted it. Remember that boat. She never fired a shot that afternoon, and it will matter later. Now go back to 2:52, 7 minutes after the first torpedoes hit the carrier, and follow the one that reached North Carolina. She was the newest battleship in the fleet, the first of America's new fast battleships. and Kinashi's torpedo opened a hole in her side more than 30 feet long. Hundreds of tons of seawater came in. She heeled 5.5 degrees to port, down by the head, trailing a heavy oil slick. The blast flash reached the handling room of her forward 16-inch turret. Deep in the ship, 5 men were dead or dying. 1 washed overboard, 1 in a flooded washroom, 3 in a compartment that sat directly over the explosion. What happened next took 6 minutes. Counterflooding began almost at once. Seawater let into tanks on the opposite side to lever the ship upright. By 2:58, the list was gone. The engineering plant answered every bell. Speed came up from 19 knots to 25. A battleship with a hole you could drive a truck through was making 25 knots and holding her exact place in the formation screen. She held it for 5 more hours. When she finally hauled out of line that night, it was because the fleet ordered her to a repair anchorage, not because she was failing. A repair ship patched her at Tonga, divers cutting away the shredded plating, pumping out the flooded washroom to bring out 4 bodies. Then she steamed to Pearl Harbor for a new side. The Navy's own engineers, writing it up afterward, were almost affectionate. The ship's force handled the casualty in a very efficient and businesslike manner. But the report also logged the price with cold precision. Her forward turret was to be fired only under gravest need. And she would be out of the war for 2 months, which mattered more than anyone yet knew, because her anti-aircraft battery was among the heaviest afloat, and the carrier Hornet was about to face the rest of the Japanese Navy without her. Meanwhile, 265 feet down, I-19 was living through the other side of the afternoon. Kinashi had taken her deep under the torpedoed carrier's own wake, the oldest trick for confusing sonar. The escorts hunted him for hours and put some 30 depth charges into the water around the boat, by the Japanese count. The hull held. After dark, I-19 crept away. Here is what Kinashi knew, the only thing he could know. His sound operators had heard torpedoes detonate, and when he finally looked, the carrier he had fired at was burning. That was the whole of it. The explosions miles away, in a task force he had never seen, registered to no one aboard as his. Japan credited him with a carrier. The battleship and the destroyer were not in the ledger, and, as we will see, they ended up in someone else's. Which brings us back to O'Brien, the ship from the first minute of this story, steaming away from the battle under her own power, with no dead, no fire, and no idea what was wrong with her. The torpedo had blown off her stem below the main deck, back to frame 10. That sounds catastrophic, and it was not. Destroyers are built to lose their extreme ends and live. The flooding was contained. The report called the local damage not serious of itself. The killer was invisible. The detonation had whipped the hull, a violent flexural vibration running down 348 feet of ship, the whole girder flexing like a diving board. Where the flex concentrated, amidships, near frame 104, the ship's backbone quietly failed. Keel and deep longitudinals buckled, bottom plating wrinkled between the bilge keels, rivets sheared. Every structural member that made the hull stiff had been damaged in some degree across a band of the ship's bottom, 100 feet from where the torpedo hit. A destroyer is a light ship. Her entire strength, the steel that keeps 350 feet of hull from folding, totals less than 4 square feet of cross-section. O'Brien had just lost a large fraction of it, in a place nobody could see without a dry dock. And in the whole forward area of the South Pacific in September 1942, there was no dry dock. So began 5 weeks of doing the best anyone could, and the best was not enough. She limped 280 miles to Espiritu Santo, the advance base the Navy called Button, and went alongside the seaplane tender Curtis. For 5 days, tender crews and Seabees of the 7th Construction Battalion patched holes, poured concrete into her forward bulkheads, and sent divers under the hull to plug the bottom. Then, 600 miles more to Noumea, codename White Poppy, where the repair ship Argonne welded new sections of longitudinals over the broken ones deep in her machinery spaces. Afterward, the Navy measured the gap between what was needed and what was done. Roughly 260 square inches of the ship's strength members had been damaged. The repairs replaced about 100. The replacement sections were short, offset from the lines of the original members, welded where they could be reached. And one entire category of damage, the wrinkled bottom plating itself, was overlooked and never replaced at all. None of this was negligence in any simple sense. It was men without a dry dock, reaching what they could reach, in a war that wanted every hull back at sea. The repairs looked sound. Inspections at Noumea found the hull holding. She was rated fit for 15 knots in a moderate sea and ordered home to the Navy Yard at Mare Island, California, for a real repair. She sailed on October 10th with a tanker and a destroyer for company, and the ocean, as if it were part of the experiment, stayed calm. Here is the sentence from the damage report that turns this voyage into something out of a nightmare. During the several voyages, no rough weather was encountered, and the speed of O'Brien never exceeded 12.5 knots. Hold on to that. Whatever happens next is not the sea's doing. 3 days out, a reinforcing plate on a port longitudinal was found cracked clean through. They put into Suva in Fiji, inspected everything, found nothing else, welded the crack, and went on. She left Suva on the afternoon of October 16th, crossed the international date line that midnight, and lived the same date twice. She had 3 days left. Through the 17th and 18th, the leak into the forward engine room grew, slowly, then not slowly. The repaired plate cracked again. A wrinkle in the hull plating opened a 3-inch split. By mid-morning of the 18th, the vertical keel, the ship's spine, was found cracked wide open, and new cracks were spreading under the main condenser. The captain turned toward the nearest land and had the crew jettison topside weight. Anchors, a deck winch, the torpedo tubes, spare air flasks, ammunition. That night, the task group commander weighed taking her undertow and decided against it for a reason that tells you how well these men now understood what they were riding. A tow pulls a hull apart. A turning propeller pushes it together. Keep her under her own power, screws turning, and the thrust itself would squeeze the breaking hull shut. O'Brien's own captain agreed. Her engines were now not just moving the ship, they were holding her closed. At 3:37 in the morning of October 19th, a shell plate behind the dynamo condenser cracked open with, says the report, the noise of a pistol shot. Speed came down to 9 knots, then 5. At 4:02, she turned for the island of Upolu in Samoa, 40 miles away. At 4:10, seawater reached the main switchboard and the generators died. At 4:30, the forward engine room was abandoned, 5 feet of water and rising, and the order went to the after engine room that has to stand among the strangest of the war. Keep the port engine turning at all costs. Not for speed, to hold the ship together. At 6 o'clock, the bottom opened. The forward and after halves of USS O'Brien began to move independently, the two ends working against each other, the steel between them butting and parting with each swell of a calm sea. The radio log of the little task group recorded the sequence in the language of men out of time. Back broken, abandoning second engine room. Ship is breaking in half. Abandoning ship, stand by to pick up men. They went over the side in good order. The tanker Cimarron and the destroyer Lang standing by, boats in the water. By 7:01 the last men were off, and then the crew of O'Brien floated beside their ship and watched her die, and the damage report reads like the notes of men who could not look away. At 7:46 both ends rose, the keel showing beneath the forward gun, the propellers lifting clear. At 7:53 she rolled deeply to starboard, then, slowly, righted herself, as if refusing. Her main deck came awash amidships. The two ends folded slowly together, rising as the middle settled. At 7:57, the stern went under and the head followed. The report closes the scene with 4 words. There were no explosions, no fire, no enemy within 1,000 miles. 12.5 knots, calm seas, and a torpedo hit 34 days old. She had steamed 2,800 miles since the torpedo, 1,027 of them from Suva, and died 40 miles short of an anchorage. And not one man was lost. An entire ship's company watched their ship break in half in the open Pacific, and every single one of them went home. If your father or grandfather served in O'Brien or in Cimarron or Lang, which took her people out of the water that morning, he saw something almost no sailor of any navy ever saw and lived to describe. If he ever told it at your kitchen table, tell it back in the comments with his name and his ship. That is how a crew with no ship and no graves gets remembered. The Bureau of Ships called the loss of O'Brien a costly lesson. The first ship in the history of the United States Navy destroyed by structural failure amidships from an explosion at her far end. The lesson was brought so seriously that the Navy rebuilt its repair doctrine around it and shipped floating dry docks across the Pacific so that no hull would again face that voyage on a broken spine. Kinashi's fifth hit had done more than sink a destroyer. It had killed her in a way the US Navy did not know a ship could be killed. While O'Brien was dying by installments, Washington was deciding what to say. And the two announcements that came out of that October are a study in how a Navy at war handles the truth. O'Brien broke in half on October 19th. Navy Department Communique number 163 announced her loss on October 21st, 2 days later, with the honest and, for once, cheerful note that all of her personnel were believed rescued. Wasp had been on the bottom since September 15th. Her loss was announced on October 26th in Communique number 168. 41 days of silence. The communique explained itself, and the explanation was sound war logic. She had sunk with no enemy in sight, so the announcement was delayed as long as there remained a probability that the Japanese did not know she was gone. Let the enemy keep searching for a carrier that no longer existed. But set Communique 168 beside the ship's own clocks, and it does a little more than delay. It says the crew fought the fires for about 3 hours before abandoning ship. The captain's order came 35 minutes after the hits. It says she stayed afloat 5 hours. She stayed afloat more than 6. Nothing in it is a lie exactly. It is a loss, straightened up for publication. And on that same October 26th, the very next communique reported that one of our aircraft carriers had been severely damaged northeast of Guadalcanal. That ship was Hornet, left to hold the South Pacific alone after Wasp went down, now fighting 4 Japanese carriers at Santa Cruz. She did not survive it. From the anti-aircraft screen around her that day, 2 ships were missing. The battleship North Carolina in a Pearl Harbor dry dock with a torpedo hole, and the destroyer O'Brien on the bottom of Samoa. The Navy's own historians would later count their absence a significant factor in how many Japanese aircraft got through to Hornet. Kinashi's Salvo was still sinking American ships 6 weeks after he fired it. So tally what each side believed. The Americans knew 3 ships had been torpedoed in 9 minutes across 2 task forces, and, as the Pacific Fleet's own assessment admitted, could not say whether 2 submarines had done it or 3. On that reading, the Navy settled into an answer that lasted a generation. Wasp was credited to I-19, and the hits on North Carolina and O'Brien were credited to a second boat, I-15. The submarine whose only confirmed act that day was watching through a periscope as the Americans scuttled. Their own carrier was written into history as the one that torpedoed a battleship and a destroyer. The Japanese knew less. Kinashi reported the carrier. The hits on North Carolina and O'Brien never entered Japan's wartime accounting at all. By the time anyone could compare notes, the war was over. The truth had to be assembled from Japanese records after the war, and when it was, it rewrote the afternoon. I-19 fired all 6. 1 boat, 1 approach, 1 salvo, spread across 9 minutes and about 5 miles of ocean. And once you know that, the 6 torpedoes can finally be followed, one by one, through the American reports. 2 into Wasp's starboard side, frames 36 and 62. 1 past the carrier and under Lansdowne, a dud. 1 under Mustin and on into North Carolina. 2 at O'Brien, the one her crew watched miss Aston, and the one that hit. Count them. That is all 6 wakes, accounted for with none left over for the third explosion the captain of Wasp logged as a torpedo. The engineers of the Bureau of Ships had argued from the evidence that the third blast came from inside the ship. Gasoline vapor, not a warhead. Follow the wakes and the arithmetic sides with the engineers. Those Sherman and men who stood on that deck went on believing for the rest of their lives that a third torpedo hit them. And the Navy's own communique had told the country exactly that. Lieutenant Commander Takakazu Kinashi had fired the spread that other submarine attacks still get measured against. 2 warships sunk, a battleship out of the war for 2 months, and a hand reaching forward 6 weeks to help pull down a third carrier he never saw. He was promoted. He was celebrated. And he went to his grave knowing perhaps a third of it. Japan learned that his torpedoes had hit North Carolina only after the war, from the Americans. By then, Kinashi had been dead for over a year. How he died is the final turn of this story, and it echoed the attack he had launched 2 years before. Follow the 2 submarines out of that afternoon. I-19 survived the depth charges, survived the campaign, spent that winter hauling supplies to starving Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal in rubber containers released underwater. In November 1943, off the Gilbert Islands, a year past her famous Salvo, she surfaced into the radar beam of the destroyer USS Radford. Depth charges. All hands, 105 men, are still aboard her. Kinashi was not among them. He had been detached 2 months before her loss, and in October 1943, Japan gave its best shot, the mission that tells you what they thought of him. Command of Ysaun's 29, a submarine bound for occupied France, one of the handful of boats that ran the whole gauntlet, the Indian Ocean, the Cape, the Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay, to trade cargo and technology with Germany. The movement records introduce him with a title, former commanding officer of I-19 and victor over USS Wasp. In Lorient, the German submariners hosted his crew at a chateau in Brittany. Kinashi traveled to Berlin, where Adolf Hitler personally decorated him with the Iron Cross, second class, for sinking the Wasp. Stop on that image for a moment. A German medal from Hitler's hand for 6 torpedoes fired in the South Pacific. For the return run, I-29 was loaded with the future. Blueprints and engines for the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter and the rocket-powered 163. Radar sets, 20 Enigma machines. Among her passengers rode Commander Eiichi Iwaya, the naval aviation engineer carrying Japan's jet program in his luggage. Both the boat and the courier surface again at the far end of the war, in the story of the Biker, Japan's last-ditch pulse jet weapon. This voyage is where those blueprints came from. The threads of this war keep crossing. American codebreakers were reading the schedule. On July 26, 1944, in the Ballintang Channel, north of Luzon, the submarine USS Swordfish was waiting on the surfaced I-29's plotted track and fired 4 torpedoes. And here the story closes its circle so exactly it is hard to type. I-29's lookout saw the wakes coming, just as O'Brien's lookouts had seen the wake coming at 2:54 on September 15, 1942. Kinashi turned his boat to thread the spread, to comb the wakes, exactly as O'Brien had swung to make 1 torpedo miss. 3 of the 4 hit. The man whose salvo could not be dodged died with the incoming wakes in plain sight. Torpedoed on the surface with 105 men aboard, the same number I-19 had taken down with her a year before. Japan promoted him 2 ranks to Rear Admiral posthumously. The jet blueprints, flown ahead from Singapore as paper, made it to Tokyo. The engines went down with the ship. The third ship of his salvo outlived them all, and her story runs longest of the 3. North Carolina came out of dry dock with a new side, fought across the entire Pacific, and today floats in a river in Wilmington, North Carolina, as a museum. And in 1986, 4 elderly Japanese men walked up her gangway, veterans of I-19's crew, guests of the Battleship's Reunion Association. The Americans handed them a gift, a framed fragment of the Type 95 torpedo that had blown the hole in the ship's side in 1942. The men who had fired the weapon stood on the deck it had holed and accepted a piece of it back as a keepsake. The Wasp's crew got their closure later and deeper. In January 2019, the research vessel Petrel, hunting with sonar 14,000 feet down in the South Pacific, found her, upright, hull intact, her deck-edge elevator still recognizable, sitting in the dark 77 years after Lansdowne's torpedoes put her under. The director of Naval History, who was aboard for the search, wrote that the wreck of a warship is the only headstone her dead will ever have. Around the same time, a historian at the Naval History and Heritage Command went back through the records of her dead and corrected a number that had stood in the book since Captain Sherman's first grieving report. Not 193 plus the correspondent, but 176 in all, 25 officers, 150 men, and Jack Singer of the International News Service. The gap between the captain's count and the archives count, 17 men, has never been fully explained, and we are not going to invent an explanation for it. Some of the fog of September 15th has simply never lifted. The spine of this story is not reconstruction from memory or legend. The bracketing of O'Brien, the 4-foot miss, the pistol shot crack in the night, the order to keep the propeller turning to hold the ship together. All of it is in the Navy's own war damage reports, written within months by the Bureau of Ships. The 41 days are in the Navy Department's communiques, which we checked line by line against the ship's clocks. Kinashi's 3 failed weeks and his last turn to comb the wakes are in the movement records of the Imperial Navy's own submarines. We went through all of it so you could hear this the way the paper tells it. Captain Sherman, the last living man off the Wasp, rebuilt his career from the water up. In 1949, he became the youngest chief of naval operations in American history, the sailor who lost his carrier ending up in command of the entire United States Navy. He died in office, still serving, in 1951. The landing signal officer who jumped from Wasp's platform, David McCampbell, became the Navy's ace of aces. 34 Japanese aircraft, 9 of them in a single mission. 6 torpedoes fired in seconds, and the wakes ran on for years. Through a broken destroyer off Samoa, through Hornet's thin screen at Santa Cruz, through a strait north of Luzon, all the way down to a sonar screen over the sea floor south of San Cristobal. Not one of the men involved on either side lived to see the full account of those 9 minutes. It had to be assembled from both Navy's papers, laid side by side, decades too late for any of them. If a man in your family served in Wasp, O'Brien, North Carolina, or the ships that saved their crews, Lansdowne, Laffey, Duncan, Cimarron, Lang, and the rest, put his name and his ship in the comments. 2 of those 3 torpedoed ships have no grave a family can visit, and the 3rd is a museum you can walk. The names in the comments under films like this one are becoming their own kind of muster roll, and it costs nothing to add a line to it. These men held the line in the worst year of the war. Give them the one thing the ocean never does: say their names out loud.